Over the past week, there has been a dramatic change in President Barack Obama's policy towards Syria. On September 4, Obama delivered a speech saying that he had made a decision that the United States should launch a military strike against Syria. On September 10, however, Obama made a second speech in a week, saying that there was some room for diplomacy to address the issue of Syria's chemical weapons. He has now asked the Congress to delay its vote on military action against the regime of President Bashar al-Assad, whom the US accuses of having used chemical gas to kill his own people. So now, what is Obama's policy towards Syria? Does he have any policy at all towards a conflict that has claimed more than 100,000 lives? Hello, I'm Namo Abdulla in Washington, D.C., and welcome to Inside America. Joining me to discuss this subject is Dan Lehman. He's the Director of Media Relations at the Syrian Support Group, a non-government entity in the U.S. licensed to provide non-lethal support to the Free Syrian Army. His group closely works with General Salem Idris and the Supreme Military Council. Sarah Sloan is the second guest here. She's an anti-war activist. She's National Staff Coordinator of Answer Coalition, a Washington, D.C. based anti-war group that has recently been organizing protests against U.S. intervention in Syria. Thank you so much for both of you for joining us. Dan, let me start off with you. What do you think of President Obama's drastic shift? Does he have any policy at all?
Well, we were a bit disappointed in the shift. We were very much advocating for targeted strikes that would degrade Assad's military capabilities and that would lend support to the moderate rebels on the ground. So when the decision came out on Saturday that Obama would be deferring that decision to Congress, we were a little bit disappointed, as were the rebels and the political opposition. I think that there is a plan in place. I think we do need to wait and see what the position of the Russians and their plan will be, but I don't think that we should wait very long to see what that is. Because with every going day, the Assad regime is transporting men and materiel out of their positions, which they think are threatened by potential U.S. strikes, into civilian areas. And even though U.S. intelligence has claimed to be keeping up with those movements, we're very concerned about what it could turn into.
So you were disappointed because you think that a U.S. military strike is necessary to end the conflict?
Exactly. Not to end the conflict, but rather as more of a means of backing Assad into a corner so that he's more willing to go to meaningful negotiations with the political opposition in Geneva.
Sarah, do you agree with the argument that he's making that the only way to make the rebels to change the balance of power in Syria is for the United States to intervene? And is this going to make the situation better in Syria?
Right. Well, we do believe it's the orientation of the U.S. government that a stepped-up intervention would be required to change the balance of forces, because the forces they support, the opposition, so-called rebel forces, are losing the civil war. We, however, strongly oppose U.S. intervention. We oppose the missile strikes that President Obama proposed, and we also oppose all the different forms of intervention, from bombing to support to the opposition to any sanctions that could be levied. We stand firmly against U.S. intervention. We believe the U.S. government wants to carry out intervention in Syria for their own interests, not because they care about the Syrian people, not because they care about the so-called national security of the American people, but because they have a policy of overthrowing all independent nationalist governments and installing puppet governments that do U.S. bidding. And we stand strongly against their policy of attempting to recolonize the entire world.
You mentioned interest. I mean, it's definitely interest is more important than anything else. Interest trumps human rights, trumps morality, and everything else in international politics. But don't you think sometimes interests also coincide with the moral argument that President Obama is making? It's necessary to intervene to stop President Bashar al-Assad's regime to kill people. Isn't that something that you want to happen?
Well, we believe the U.S. government is doing what they always do, having a pretext for intervention, which, as you said, is just in their own interest, in the interest of Wall Street and the big banks and corporations, the people that all U.S. policy is in the interest of. We believe the moral argument, the humanitarian argument, is actually just a complete lie, just like the argument about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq put forward by the Bush administration was a lie. We don't believe bombing or military intervention is ever in the interest of the people on the ground. Bombs don't help people. They don't solve humanitarian problems. They create humanitarian problems because they rain death and destruction on any country. The U.S. likes to use words like surgical strikes, but there's so many examples of of course, civilians being killed by U.S. bombs, U.S. missiles, and we believe that will only result in destruction. We believe that civil war, when civil wars go on and never come to an end, it's generally because an outside force has intervened, and we really hold the U.S. government responsible and other foreign countries responsible for funding the opposition forces in keeping the civil war going. Otherwise, it likely would have come to an end.
Interesting. Then the conflict has become more sectarian recently, and you are asking the United States and other foreign powers to provide the rebels with the necessary needs, I think including arms, to keep the balance of power between the regime of President Bashar al-Assad and the rebels.
Right.
But how can that make the situation any better? I mean, Assad has a lot of advanced weaponry that he's got from Russia. The more weapons you send to the rebels, don't you deepen the conflict further?
Well, the main concern is that if we support the rebels militarily, that these weapons will bleed over into the hands of extremist groups. That really is the main concern, because the elements that we work with under General Salim Idris and the Supreme Military Council, those groups are dedicated to fighting the regime only, to establishing a democratic Syria only, to protecting minorities only. They actually have a list of proclamations, a proclamation of principles that they call it, that when an FSA brigade joins the SMC, they have to agree to those principles, and they are, as I outlined, a democratic, multi-ethnic Syria free of Assad and extremist groups, and inclusive of tolerance in the future. The main concern then is not that these groups that we have vetted and that we trust and that are pro-democracy may be harmful to Syria's diverse landscape in the future if we give them weapons, but that what happens if the extremist groups get those arms. We feel very
So do you think it's because of all of these rebel groups that you have, like you have the Jabhat al-Nusra, you have some other al-Qaeda affiliates, that President Obama seems entirely confused? One day he says, I'm going to launch a military strike. Then after a week he says, there's room for diplomacy to solve the problem.
I'm not sure that's the entire reason, but that definitely does contribute to the confusion on the ground. The statistics on the ground are this. You have about 150,000 opposition fighters total. The majority of those fall under the Supreme Military Council, though there are disparate rebel groups everywhere. About 16% of that 150,000 are associated with extremist groups, whether that be Jabhat al-Nusra, ISIS, or other spin-off elements
Where
of
do you
al-Qaeda.
get these figures?
This figure is actually from us, from our contacts on the ground, corroborated by Salim Idris, and actually reflects what Kerry said in his speech during the hearings last week.
I would like to have your take, Sarah, on President Obama's recent shift,
Right.
Why do you think he changed his mind? Is it because there's a lot of pressure from Russia?
Well, we believe it's a result of the massive, both domestic and global opposition. Part of that is the opposition by the Russian government, but in fact, it became politically untenable domestically for President Obama to proceed. And we consider that to be just an incredibly significant and historically rare development for a U.S. president to have to make a complete 180 and reverse course because of the opposition. We saw that President Obama was not going to win the vote in the House. He was maybe not going to win it in the Democratic-controlled Senate. All the Congress people were reporting that 100 to 1 their constituents were contacting them opposing the war, that when they went to even to the grocery store, they were confronted by opposition from the people. The vast majority of people in this country were against this war, and their power was felt by really forcing the president to pull back, and that was coupled with global opposition, which in England forced the British Parliament, the junior partner of the U.S., Obama's chief ally, to pull back.
Didn't Obama expect that big opposition, as you said? I mean, even the polls in the United States, all of them, including a poll by the Washington Post and ABC, one by CNN, they point to the fact that majority of Americans are against a U.S. military strike in Syria.
Well,
Didn't President Obama expect that?
I believe he did, and I believe he used very terrible, crass formulations to try to win the American public over. This formulation of no boots on the ground, which he repeated over and over and over. All that means is that all the bleeding is going to be on the Syrian side. All the death and destruction will be on the Syrian side. So just go on with your lives. American people, keep watching TV. Don't worry. It won't be you. It won't be your family members who are going to have to die in a new war in the Middle East. And he hoped that that would win the American people over. But luckily, it didn't. I mean, luckily, enough people in the United States recognize that they care too about their brothers and sisters in Syria. They don't want to see the U.S. carry out a new war there, and really took a strong stand against it. There were widespread anti-war protests, other manifestations of that opposition here in the U.S., and of course there was international opposition amongst people and amongst many world governments. So we think it really shows the power of the people that Obama had to change course. And we don't believe this is over, of course, and that we must keep the pressure on to prevent him from proceeding with any kind of military action.
Dan, you said you were disappointed by President Obama's speech, but most Americans seem to be happy about President Obama's latest speech about Syria. So what would you make of that?
Well, we weren't disappointed by the speech itself, the speech the other night where he clarified the position. We were disappointed by the fact that he deferred this decision to Congress in the first place, and that the American people are not supportive. But I totally disagree. I think you mischaracterized why the American people are not supportive. It's not because they understand so much about the conflict that they don't want to see Syrian lives lost. I believe it's because there's this post-Iraq, post-Afghanistan, post-war mindset that is kind of creating this neo-imperial or neo-isolationism in the United States. Most people that I will talk to, whether it be at home, my friends, people that are just not really part of advocating for the Syrian cause, they don't really know anything about the conflict. They don't understand Assad, they don't understand the chemical attacks, they don't understand that the opposition is primarily moderate, not made up of all extremists. So I believe that the lack of support for strikes comes not from an understanding of the conflict and not wanting to see Syrians die, but from misunderstanding all of the implications that will come if we don't intervene, whether those be implications for our allies in the region, whether those be to our own national security, whether those be to threats to Syria's future democracy.
Well, you mentioned national security. I recently read a very interesting article in the New York Times. I think it was on the front page. The article quotes Alan Pincus. He is the former Israeli consul general in New York City. He said, referring to both the rebels and the Assad, let them both bleed, remortgage to death. That's the strategic thinking here. As long as this lingers, there is no real threat from Syria. So that's what he thinks, that we believe that more the conflict goes on, there's
the less
no
of a
real
threat to the U.S. it'll be.
Isn't that a Machiavellian way of thinking?
That's a ridiculous argument. Ann Coulter said something similar the other day. I think she said, tell me why gassing Arabs is a bad thing. Don't we just not intervene, let them all kill each other? And she called it enlightened non-interventionism. And that if we allowed them to kill each other, there would be less of a threat to us. I mean, you can see that this is clearly not the case. As the international community fails to get behind the opposition, this is allowing extremist groups to grow. Extremist groups can grow, and they have a territorial bastion of security, training camps, supplies of weapons from their wealthy Gulf benefactors. This is obviously very much creating a threat, not only to U.S. national security interests, but to those of our allies.
Do you agree with that? Yeah.
Because the quote is very interesting, actually. It's the Israelis speak more bluntly than U.S. government officials, but in fact that's completely in conformity with how the U.S. government and the Pentagon thinks. They used to speak more bluntly. In the Iran-Iraq war, they said, we hope both sides would just kill each other. That's what they wanted. And in fact, they want that. While they want really any government but Assad, because they want a puppet regime, a regime more likely to bend to their will than the Assad government, they also want to degrade Syria. They want to weaken Syria. They want this conflict, they want the civil war to go on, because they want all countries in the Middle East to be weak, because the U.S. government wants to be the dominant power. They want to be the hegemonic power everywhere in the world, particularly in the oil-rich Middle East. So I think, in fact, that quote, which is completely disgusting, is how a lot of people in the U.S. government think, that weaker,
and the fact that has been
all forces being weaker are better, and they don't care who's on the other side. They don't care who the opposition to Assad is. It's not because they're so democratic and care so much for human rights. It's because they see the one remaining independent, nationalist-oriented Arab government, and they want to overthrow it.
But and the fact there has been no action taken against towards the conflict also reinforces the notion that this is the kind of thinking that's dominant in the United States and in Israel.
And in fact, the action they've taken is supplying arms, which we see now. The Washington Post reported the arms are now flowing in from the U.S. to the opposition side. They say they have this distinction between the moderate parts and al-Qaeda, but I don't think they care. They are fueling a civil war. They're preventing it from coming to an end because they want it to go on. And of course they do have, I'm not saying in this instance they don't care which side wins. They want the Assad government overthrown. They have pursued that tactic through fueling a civil war. The opposition has been losing. The opposition recognizes and the U.S. government recognizes that there has to be a stepped up foreign intervention if there's a hope of them winning. And that's why the military strikes are now on the table, and I think they only haven't proceeded.
Are you against any sort of intervention, U.S. intervention? Are you against also the creation of a no-fly zone for the rebels?
We oppose U.S. intervention in all of its different forms, and that's actually an important thing to distinguish because the U.S. government has many tactics when they wage war against a country, and we don't consider war to solely be bombings and ground invasions. Supplying arms to one side in a civil war is a form of warfare. Just providing them with international legitimacy by recognizing them is part of that. Economic and financial sanctions, cyber attacks, these are all different tactics in the U.S.
So what is wrong with
arsenal
now
of
if the
warfare.
United States decided to create a no-fly zone for the refugees to go back and a safe haven? Isn't that something good? It's a U.S. intervention, but that's morally good. That's what it seems, right?
I don't think when it seems the U.S. government is doing something that's morally good or in a humanitarian interest, it ever is actually that. That they really only take action in their own interest. I don't think they care
their
about
own interest can be about doing something that's good for the people as well in Syria, right? It can be.
Right. I don't think anyone disagrees that at the heart of the U.S.'s goals is its own national interest and our own national security. You agree with that, I agree with that, I think many people agree with that. But look what's happened throughout the past 2 years of non-interventionism. You have 110,000 people dead. Millions are in political prisons. We've heard that when people are taken to political prison, they're basically as good as dead. There is no release from those things. You have millions of IDPs, hundreds of thousands, millions of refugees, and in a single 4-hour period, the Assad government was able to gas to death 1,400 people. All this has come about in a period of American non-interventionism. Now, if the U.S. can strike and they can take out Assad's military capabilities to the point where he realizes he is not going to be able to continue the fight against the rebels, he's already operating only 3 divisions of his 12-division army because those are the only ones that he can trust. His manpower is very, very limited. You're already seeing defections, even with the U.S. thinking about strikes. The former defense minister defected. You have soldiers defecting every day. If you can put Assad in that corner and you can get him to come to Geneva to negotiate with Ahmed Jarba and the members of the political opposition, and you bring the conflict to an end that way, you can do in a matter of months what has not been done in 2 years of over 100,000 people dying.
But there is no legal basis for the United States to, as you said, take out Assad's military capabilities, right? The United Nations Security Council is opposed to it because Russia and China are opposed to it.
Right.
And then the Congress doesn't seem to even, even if the Congress authorizes it, but that's not enough in terms of international legal recognition.
Well, people have thrown around this whole right to protect, or responsibility to protect idea, and this I think is the most legitimate thing that you can put out there as an argument for intervening on behalf of the Syrian people. Obama doesn't need congressional approval to conduct these limited strikes. He just doesn't. That is not within war powers. But I think from an international perspective, yes, because the UN has become a debating society and because we can't get anything past Russia and China because they remember how they were had by the West in Libya, I think that is the primary legal basis that we can use to conduct these strikes or intervene in some other way.
Can I just say, it's highly illegal for the United States government to carry out these military strikes with or without congressional approval. The UN Charter, Article 51, says that you cannot attack another country who has not attacked you. This is aggression on the part of the U.S. government, and it's what they always do. It's carried out in their own interest, and it's highly illegal. It's a violation of international law, and it's just that's one reason to stand against it. But it's important to note that it is completely illegal. It's not just a matter of whether there's a veto in the UN Security Council. it is a violation of the UN Charter.
In today's New York Times, in the front page, there's Vladimir Putin has a very interesting opinion piece. He basically says the same thing. He says, let's not make the United Nations like the League of Nations, which had no power at all. Is the United States trying to do that?
Well, I think in reality that's the case no matter what. When there's one economic, military, hegemonic superpower in the world, they're by necessity going to dominate any international institution. So we don't look to the United Nations to kind of solve this crisis or change any situation fundamentally. We recognize that when the U.S. government can use the United Nations as cover, they do. Like in Iraq, for example, where the sanctions on Iraq, which the UN's own agencies ultimately admitted killed over 1.5 million people, those were United Nations sanctions. But if the U.S. can't use the UN for cover, then they go on their own. So they just use the UN as a tool for international cover when it's convenient for them. So we're not putting the UN or certainly the UN Security Council on a pedestal in any way, but you can recognize through the UN's own charter the violation of international law that the U.S. government would be carrying out if they did intervene. And to say, I mean, there haven't been military strikes yet, but the U.S. government is already intervening by providing arms and other support to opposition forces in a civil war. And I think to this formulation that's just so oft repeated in the media, as if you say it over and over, it'll become true, that, I mean, one, that it was the Assad government that used the chemical weapons on August 21st. That hasn't been proven. Obama has no evidence.
It hasn't been proven, right? We don't really know. I mean, the United States says that the Syrian government has used chemical gas, but Putin, in his piece today, he says it's the opposition.
Right. Well, who was the woman that was on? Madeleine Albright did an interview with Wolf Blitzer yesterday, and she said that Putin is a liar. Salim Idrissa said that Putin is a liar. Putin is a liar. It has been proven that chemical weapons were used. There are intercepted cables between members of the 155th Brigade of the 4th Armored Division communicating with their chemical weapons command and with Assad, asking whether or not chemical weapons could be used. Signal intelligence picked up on movements at chemical research facilities, at chemical weapons military storage facilities prior to the attacks. And we know, I mean, we have the coordinates of exactly where those rockets were fired from. And one of them sits directly beside the main chemical research facility in Damascus. There are a number of things that a number of different countries, with the exception of Russia, have provided to confirm that, in fact, the regime is responsible for that. That Russia is saying that the rebels were responsible, that's what Russia does, because Russia likes to piss off the United States, and Russia acts for its own interests. It is the
Let me stop you here, but after a short break, we will come back to continue our discussion. Dear viewers, please stay with us. We'll be back shortly. Hello again, and welcome back to Inside America. Then you were saying that we were talking about Putin's article in which he accuses the rebels of having used the chemical gas. I mean, he doesn't just say that just like that. He says the opposition has more incentives to use the chemical gas in order to attract foreign intervention, like U.S. intervention in Syria. Doesn't that sound like a fair argument to make?
It's an opinion, it's a fair argument, but it doesn't reflect what has happened on the ground. We have documented, I mean, there have been 63, I guess now 65 instances that Assad has used either sarin in diluted proportions with some other gas, or some form of chlorine gas, something like that, against rebels and against civilian communities. There's been a trend developing in Damascus specifically, where it seems to be if the rebels get too close in the eastern suburbs, Assad will spray them with gas as a threat to not come any closer. He's been trying to get the rebels out of those neighborhoods for 7 to 10 months now. The chemical attacks were immediately followed by a ground offensive by the 4th Armored Division, seeking to puncture those neighborhoods from the south and clear the rebels out because they were such a threat to the center of Damascus. So that's an interesting argument that Putin makes, that the rebels would have more of an incentive to use gas. But the facts are, one, the rebels don't have gas. They don't have the ability to deliver the gas, even if they did have these chemicals. And two, Assad is the one that has been using them.
So you believe for sure that President Assad has crossed President Obama's red line?
Absolutely. It's not even a matter of what I believe. It's the facts that have been presented, yes.
Can I just jump in on that?
Sure.
I mean, in fact, President Obama, in all his attempts to sell this war to the American people and to Congress, has not provided any evidence, including in his a speech that he just gave. There's no evidence. It's just this continual assertion that this thing is just a fact, it's true, and it's certainly not only the Russian government that has suggested that it was the rebels who did this. When President Obama sent his administration officials on a Sunday morning talk show circuit to try to sell this war to the public, they had to admit, in fact, they did not have irrefutable evidence, and that they had used what they called a common sense test. And I would say the common sense test tells you that it was not the Assad government.
And they actually say that, I mean, I would like to stay with you, Sarah, but they actually say, the U.S. officials, including John Kerry, they don't say we are 100% sure. They say we have high confidence. I've heard that repeatedly from U.S. officials.
You heard that in 2003, too, right? When Bush wanted to go into Iraq, that they had all this intelligence that proved that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, and now that's all disproven. So we certainly, have to take a very critical eye when U.S. government officials assert that they have great intelligence, because we know the track record. And just wanted to make this point about this so-called common sense test. You apply that. Why would the Assad government use chemical weapons now? Why would they do the thing that they know would trigger increased U.S. intervention at the moment that only helps the opposition? It is only right now in the interests of the opposition forces to use the weapons that would draw in the U.S. government. It is not in the interest of the Assad government. It makes no sense for them from a military point of view.
Can you answer that question?
Yeah, so you're premising your argument on the fact that, or on the idea that Obama is trying to beat the war drums and encourage America to go to war. But this is the first instance. Look at the history of the Syrian conflict. When has the administration ever, until this point, seemed to be interested in getting even remotely involved in Syria? As an advocate of this cause, and as someone who has been working at this for a year now, I can tell you that we have not seen this before. It has been very difficult to push the Obama administration towards any sort of action, towards any sort of even non-lethal support for the military opposition. So to say that he is on this campaign to get the American people to agree to a war is just not true. The fact is, he probably shouldn't have established the red line to begin with, but now that it has been so clearly crossed, he really has no choice to protect the U.S.'s credibility and his own not to act. I think you also said that what reason does the Assad...
Dan, I would like to stay on that point.
Sure.
Earlier in your comments, you mentioned neo-isolationism in the U.S. Are you referring to Obama also as a neo-isolationist, as you were saying that it's been very difficult to push him to take any action?
No, I'm saying that this whole post-war, what I was saying is this whole post-war mentality that the American people have. Obama has it too. Obama was brought into office on the precedent that he would get America out of wars. What I'm saying is I think that this whole attitude has contributed to a growth of neo-isolationism in the U.S., both in the administration and amongst the American people, that is having the effect of limiting the amount of attention people are paying to the actual conflict in Syria and what is actually going on, which leads to arguments like this, that what reason does Assad have to use weapons? How do we know he used weapons? If you paid attention to the facts and the movements on the ground, you would understand these processes. And
why is there so much opposition towards this war in Syria? If Saddam Hussein didn't use chemical gas in 2003. He had used it before.
Yeah.
But 73% of Americans initially supported the Iraq war.
Right. I think it is, like I say, this post-war fear of getting involved in yet another Middle East conflict. People, I think, don't trust that limited strikes will occur on their own and that boots on the ground won't be deployed immediately thereafter. People are tired. People are tired of war. People are tired of involvement in the Middle East. But what they don't realize is that that tiredness, that war weariness, is not an excuse not to punish someone that is willing to kill hundreds of thousands of their own people and to protect our own interests and our own security going forward. If we leave this issue alone, this is only going to come back to bite us in a very big way when the Assad government falls and when Syria potentially becomes in some part a bastion of extremism.
Can I make a couple points?
Sure, but I would like to ask you another question, Sarah. You can also, make your point as well. Currently, people hope that Russians and Americans can, get the weapons, the chemical weapons of the Syrian government under the international control, right, and eventually destroy them. Is that really possible to do in a war zone?
Right. Well, this whole notion that the possession of chemical weapons by the Syrian government is somehow the biggest threat to world peace is really kind of absurd. I mean, the U.S. government possesses and uses chemical weapons. The Israelis have used chemical weapons supplied by, funded by the United States government. The U.S. government certainly, when it's militarily in their interest, has no qualm with chemical weapons, which are horrible, which is a horrible weapon.
When have they done that?
Just let me.
Sure.
So, it's this like super focus when the U.S. government is clearly the biggest threat to peace and to security all over the world, because they're the ones who carry out unprovoked interventions and aggression around the world. So, I think that's sort of kind of turning the whole reality of the world on its head to suddenly super focus on one government that may possess chemical weapons. I wanted to make a couple other.
President Obama made a very fair point in his speech. He said, you have Geneva Convention that bans the use of chemical gas, and it's a big deal. Like using chemical weapons, it's a big deal. Like it doesn't distinguish between an infant and a soldier, right? It kills everybody equally.
Right,
the United States should be mad at that, right?
Chemical weapons should be abolished from the planet, and we should be talking not just about destroying chemical weapons that exist in Syria, but all chemical weapons in the world. Why is the U.S. government suddenly saying they're going to broker this deal to take control of Syria's chemical weapons and not saying anything about the weaponry they possess themselves? It's always like that. It's always Iran can't build a nuclear weapon, but the United States can possess nuclear weapons. The United States can be the only country in the history of the world to utilize nuclear weapons, and yet they don't want anyone questioning the massive arsenal that they stockpile, that they continue to build. And that's how it always is when the U.S. government talks about another country's weapons. It's never about the fact that they actually have a bigger stockpile of those weapons and more of a readiness
if we
to
get
use
back
them
to
than any other
the
country.
question, do you think it is possible for this Russia-U.S. deal to work?
I think it is possible. I think right now the Obama administration wants it to work because they recognize the level of opposition that exists to military intervention, and they don't have any basis because they have no evidence that they can present to try to win people over to move forward with it. So for them, it's really more of a face-saving measure than anything else to pull back from the precipice that they had placed themselves onto. But I think the important thing to note is that this war is continuing. And one of the points I wanted to make earlier is that the U.S. government and specifically the Obama administration have been intervening in Syria. They've been intervening for 2 years. Supplying weapons to opposition forces is intervention. That is
Has the United States supplied weapons to the rebels?
From the reports I got as of yesterday morning, no U.S. purchased or U.S. supplied weapons had hit the ground. This morning there was that Washington Post story, but our SMC sources don't comment on that. But what I can tell you is that up until yesterday, at least, only Saudi and Qatari weapons and Croatian weapons, things like that, have gone in. Nothing
Well,
else.
and what's the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia and Qatar? These are U.S. allies. They're U.S.-supported governments. The U.S. works in concert with them. But the U.S. government has, and Obama
So
administration
you're
have
saying
openly
the U.S. sells weapons to Saudi
saying-
Arabia and Saudi Arabia gives it to the
and
rebels?
the U.S. government is openly saying that they're providing weapons to the opposition forces. I mean, this whole notion to paint this picture that somehow just like this evil, cruel dictator is this menace to society and these opposition forces are some pure forces trying to save the Syrian people is totally ludicrous. There is a civil war. When there is a civil war, people on both sides kill and are killed, but the reality of what's happening is completely different. The reality is the U.S. government wants to overthrow the Assad government, not because he's the next Hitler, as they'd like to paint him, but because he represents an independent nationalist government that the U.S. government does not want to allow to exist anywhere in the world, especially in the Middle East. That's what's happening here.
Dan, one more question to you, and then after that we will take a short break.
Okay.
Is it in the United States says we're not going to overthrow President Bashar al-Assad? That's what Obama said. He said we know from our experience that removing a dictator by force is problematic.
Right.
But is that the eventual U.S. goal?
The eventual U.S. goal is to have the Assad regime replaced by someone democratically elected, yeah. That being said, these strikes and anything further, they're not focused on taking Assad out. It's not time for that yet. The political opposition needs to continue to develop to the point where they can make a safe transition to take over from Assad. So that's why we're saying that ultimately We want any sort of intervention, whether it be strikes or continued supplies, arms, if the U.S. has supplied arms, which I'm hoping that they will start if they haven't, that it'd be focused on getting Assad to Geneva to negotiate, to be able to transition power to this new government.
Dear viewers, we will be back after another short break. Please stay with us. Hello again and welcome back to Inside America. Dan, we were discussing the prospect of the United States supplying weapons to the rebels. I'd like now to move to the ground in Syria. You have so many different rebel groups, and one of those rebel groups is a Kurdish rebel group. But when we are talking about supplying weapons to the rebels, we're not talking about to the Kurdish rebels, right?
We're talking about supplying weapons to groups that fall under the Supreme Military Council, under General Idris and his command. If there are Kurdish contingents within that, which I believe to some extent that there are, then yes, as long as they sign the Proclamation of Principles, agree to these principles, don't commit war crimes, and abide by the limitations of the SMC, yes.
But I think there have been some reports that the PYD, which is the biggest militant Kurdish group in Syria, is siding with the Assad regime, and that's why the United States is not going and is not willing to provide weapons to that group.
To that particular group?
Yeah.
That's an interesting argument. I mean, yeah, the PYD to some extent, and I'm not totally clear on all of the different Kurdish factions and their specific affiliations because there are so many. But yes, I mean, contingents of the PYD have been lining up on the side of the regime. Like an example, in Afrin, in northwest Aleppo, Kurdish forces were lining up with members of Hezbollah, members of the Iranian IRGC, Shabiha, members of the National Army, this new militia that Hezbollah and Iran have trained, to launch an offensive on Aleppo city, most of which is held by the FSA. So yes, parts of the PYD are aligning with the regime.
In the Kurdish regions of Syria, the Kurds have already gained control of their regions, and there are Kurdish flags flying over their administrative building. The Assad regime has withdrawn its forces in much of the areas. So what's your opinion about that, the advance that Kurds have made? Are we seeing a Kurdish spring there?
Well, I think it would be fair to say that we're seeing a small Kurdish spring. Yeah, I mean, Kurds are they're members of the population of Syria. So if the regime has pulled out of their areas, there's no fighting going on, and they're able to establish localized governments that keeps their people happy, that keeps their people supplied, and keeps extremism from entering those communities, then yeah, I mean, we have no problem with that. We would rather.
Just one more question to you: the Free Syrian Army or the opposition, and there's a rift between the Kurds and the opposition, and that has been problematic, of course, because even in terms of the international suppliers, they don't know who to fund, who to support. Why is that? Why do you think, like as a spokesperson for this group that wants support for the Free Syrian Army, why doesn't the Arab rebels and the Kurdish rebels want to come together?
Well, like I said, they have been working together in some extent. I mean, there have been evidence of FSA forces working directly alongside Kurdish units to fight the regime. Now there's a threat that's positioning itself both to the Kurdish towns and to the FSA. Like, for example, Tel Abyad, ISIS, Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham, we were discussing before the show, came in, threatened to wipe out all the Kurds and to establish Tel Abyad as part of their emirate there. So to prevent threats like this and to prevent threats of the regime where the regime is incurring on Kurdish territory, there has been cooperation between Arab Sunni rebels and Kurds.
Sarah, but I know the situation is really complex in Syria. We all know that. We have a lot of groups, a lot of ethnic communities and sectarian groups. But what should we do about it? It's been more than 2 years. 100,000 people have died. Why should all the focus be on these chemical weapons that's killed maybe 1,500 people, right?
Right. Well, the point, this sort of idea of what should we do or what should the U.S. government do, the reality is the U.S. government has fueled this civil war. If the U.S. government stops intervening in civil wars that are taking place in other countries, generally civil wars do come to an end when there's not an outside force supporting, funding, arming.
But it's not just the United States, to be fair. It's Iran and Russia as well, which are also intervening in the conflict and making the situation worse.
Many other, several other countries are intervening. So without foreign intervention, civil wars do come to an end. With foreign intervention, civil wars frequently go on for a significant period of time. I mean, from our point of view, and it's important to distinguish President Obama, the administration officials, they talk about U.S. interests as if the interests of the U.S. government and the interests of the American people are identical. We believe they're actually the opposite in many ways. That what the U.S. government is doing now is in the interest of the U.S. government, is in the interest of a small handful of people who can benefit financially from what they're doing. Absolutely not in the interest of the American people. And also, I'm not making a
what is the financial interest
argument either.
What is the financial interest for the United States in, say, toppling Assad?
It's in being able to have a puppet government, and I don't think they care whether that government is for democracy and human rights. Look at their relationship to Saudi Arabia. That's not what the U.S. cares about. The U.S. cares, does the government bend to its will? Does the government obey its dictates? The Assad government is maintained independence from the United States. It's a nationalist-oriented government, unlike the governments that work closely with the United States. And while Syria itself might not be as oil-rich like Iraq and Saudi Arabia, because it's in the Middle East, the U.S. wants to control, they want to degrade every government, every country that exists in that region so that they can control the land, so they can control the resources, so they can control the people. That's what this is all about. It's absolutely not about the humanitarian interests of the Syrian people.
John Kerry told senators that inaction is riskier than action, but you believe the other way around. You believe action is actually riskier and making the conflict.
Well, they're arguing on a completely different level. They're talking about the interests of the U.S. government, and there's clearly a debate in the Obama administration, and in fact, Obama, until the last 2 weeks, hasn't been pushing for military action. He's been very wary of it. He's been using other means. It's only in the past few weeks that he's begun to try to sell the American public and Congress on military intervention, which he's actually been a constraint on up until now. But it doesn't mean there's any disagreement over their ultimate goal, which is regime change. And I think our point is that regime change is not it's not appropriate for the U.S. government to overthrow other governments of the world. It's also a mischaracterization to act as if the Assad government is completely isolated, has no domestic support. In fact, there's widespread support for the Assad government in Syria. There's a civil war. It's been ongoing. So we can't allow the U.S. government's mixed characterizations of this situation to just continue. We have to actually characterize it accurately and see the potential U.S. intervention in that context.
But why has the whole the whole thing been reduced to these chemical weapons? Like the whole international effort to solve the
That's
problem.
just the focal point for now. That has been the thing that has finally drawn international attention to Syria. I think Kerry even said during one of the hearings, this is not just about the chemical weapons use, this is about the larger Syrian conflict. It is just the fact that that red line has been crossed that now puts everyone in a position where they must act to save their own credibility and in part to save the Syrian people and to protect their own interests. But yeah, you're right, it's not totally about chemical weapons, it's about the larger conflict that needs to come to an end. Because, as you said, chemical weapons have killed maybe 1,500, maybe 2,000 at the most.
I mean, I think it's just kind of setting up a false situation. In fact, like I said, when there are conflicts that go on, it's often because there's foreign intervention that has their own interest in fueling them. And it ends up being really mischaracterized so that they can justify their increased intervention. And the reality is, I keep coming back to this because this is just what it comes down to, that it's not this situation where like the government's just waging this war on the people and he has to be stopped. There's a civil war. People are being killed and dying on both sides in it. The U.S. government has an interest in one side prevailing, not because that side is so great and democratic and wonderful, but because they're not the existing government that seeks to be independent of the U.S. government. And none of this has to do with the interests of the U.S. people, but I also wanted to point out before, I'm not making a isolationist argument or an argument that says, who cares what's happening in Syria, just that's their problem, that's not our problem. That's certainly not our argument. We think it deeply matters, and in fact, but what we're saying is that U.S. intervention will only have a negative impact on the Syrian people. The only people in Syria is going to have a positive impact for are the leaders of the opposition who want to become the new government and hope the U.S. can help them overthrow the existing government and install themselves as a new government. That's not in the interest of the vast majority of the Syrian people.
Because we're running out of time, on that note, I would like to ask one question to both of you, and you can answer me as brief as you can. How do you describe President Obama's foreign policy in general and his policy towards Syria? I mean, you have very opposing perspectives on Syria, but I would like to have your opinion on this.
Right.
So.
You want to
Go ahead.
Okay. Well, Obama obviously came into office based on the opposition that existed in the United States to the Iraq War, the opposition that existed to the Bush administration's very open, pro-war, pro-colonialist policy that they were carrying out all over the world. The people opposed that. That's how Obama won. And then I believe, and I expected this to happen, he completely betrayed the sort of hopes and confidence that the people who voted for him had. That this is not the first time he's began a military intervention. While he did reduce troops as he had promised, he has already carried out the massive bombing campaign of Libya, and there's quite a few analogies you can draw between Syria and Libya, where there was a civil war where the U.S. government was intervening in less direct methods, but then recognized that the side they were supporting was going to lose unless they carried out a greater intervention. And then Obama, who had been a constraint on military action, actually became a proponent of it, and they successfully overthrew the Libyan government. This is the Bush foreign policy. Right after September 11th, what did Bush do? He identified Iraq, Iran, North Korea, and then Bolton identified Libya, Syria, and Cuba as the top countries that they wanted to overthrow, and they are going one by one overthrowing those governments. So Obama's foreign policy is Bush's foreign policy.
She says it's basically
the same. Right? I totally disagree. It seems like your opinions about intervention in Syria are based more about some sort of wider distrust in the government's intentions, not so much based on fact. I mean, Obama's foreign policy is clearly not Bush's foreign policy. Bush has got into two wars that were, one of which is at least premised on misinformation. Obama was very hesitant to get involved in Libya. He's been extremely hesitant to get involved in Syria, and now finally he is. His administration has maintained a back foot stance on intervention in any foreign conflict. The congruencies that you can draw between Libya and Syria is that in both conflicts you have a dictator that was using its army to destroy civilian communities and to put down a popular uprising. And the U.S. has been reluctant to intervene in either of those, but now hopefully we'll see a shift.
Dan Lehman with the Syrian Support Group, thank you so much for talking to Ruadw. Sarah Sloan with the Anti-War Answer Coalition, thank you so much for talking to us as well. Dear viewers, thank you so much for watching. Until next time, be well.